If you use Adobe Illustrator in conjunction with Photoshop, there's a really interesting way to take advantage of smart objects between these two programs. And again, just as a bit of a history lesson, in the past, in previous versions, when you copied and pasted or placed an Illustrator file into Photoshop, it became rasterized, meaning one-way street, no link to the original Illustrator file. But now we have some options. For example, if I switch to Illustrator, here's an Illustrator graphic. If I select everything, copy it, and then switch back to Photoshop and choose Paste, it asks me, how would you like to paste it? And the first option, and the one that I would pick most of the time, is Smart Object. As soon as I click OK, calculates for a moment. Here is my graphic, as you can see, that I can bring in and scale down, do whatever I want, and when I click Enter or OK, it's now a smart object, but in this case you'll see it says Vector Smart, and it would say Object if I had a big enough panel. Which means that, once again, I've created a two-way street. For example, I look at this, I'm like, it doesn't really show up very well because it's black. Well, normally that would be tough luck, start all over again, but in this case, because of the way smart objects work, I double-click on the Vector Smart Object. It's not going to open a Photoshop document this time. It's going to go back to Illustrator and open a document, not the original, but one that says Vector Smart Object. So for example, now all of these objects here, the ones that make up most of our logo, are filled with black. So if I simply go in here and tell it that I want to fill it with white, it won't look very good right now because I'm in Illustrator on a white background, but as with other smart objects, if I close and then save this, jump back to Photoshop, you see it updates right away, even if I've done things like lowered the opacity and things like that. So that's one way if you have Illustrator running at the same time. But the other possibility is if you know you have an Illustrator file that you want to bring in, then just go to Mini Bridge. There's that Illustrator file. Now don't double click on it because that would launch Illustrator. What I'm going to do instead is go back to this Tools menu, choose Place into Photoshop. This dialog box comes up because technically behind the scenes Illustrator files are considered a PDF file just to make it easier to move things back and forth, and I click OK. As before, it will place it. I can hit Enter to finalize. Now there's one minor but kind of important difference between the two ways of doing it. When I copied and pasted it, I was just simply copying and pasting vector shapes that had no connection to a particular file. That's why when I did that, the layer name became Vector Smart Object. You see, in this case, it says Great Ideas. So it's actually recognizing the fact that this came from a file by that name. If I double click on it to edit it, though, you'll see it still opens up and says Vector Smart Object. So it's still the same concept. I can still go in and I can still make a change. And when I save it and switch back to Photoshop, it's still going to update. So this provides a really nice possibility for me to have an ongoing way of working with Illustrator files inside of Photoshop. Now, there's a little more we can do as well. Let's take a look at another example. I've got a different image open in Photoshop, and I want to bring this Illustrator file in there. So along with using the menu here to place into Photoshop, same rule apply. I can also take from Mini Bridge, just drag and drop that Illustrator file right into Photoshop, and it comes in saying, okay, I see what you're doing, click OK. It's going to come in very large, so let's just scale this down. The advantage, by the way, of using the place command is it automatically at least scales it to the size of your document. So I'll enter to finalize that. So now I have my Vector Smart Object, but I want to make it look like it's actually on this coffee cup holder, not just sort of slapped on there. So first of all, I could try a blend mode, and maybe overlay would be a little better. That looks a little more like it's printed on there perhaps, but what I want to do is make it kind of fit to the shape, and this is where we run into an initial problem. If I choose Free Transform, Command and Control T, I get regular kind of transform options for scaling, but what I really like to do is warp this. But you notice this warp option is grayed out, so you cannot warp a Vector Smart Object, unfortunately. However, there is a solution. It's just kind of odd, and that is this is a Vector Smart Object. If I right click on it, I can choose convert to smart object, which means it's going to change it from a vector smart object to a Photoshop smart object. And just by doing that, now I can do free transform, and more importantly, now I can also do warp. So I can go in here and I could choose some setting that's already built in and then just kind of play with it. I can even just do regular kind of warping where I go custom and then just myself go in and kind of warp this to fit a little bit. And I'm going to do something pretty bad and obvious just so you can see that something is happening to this, because I want to show you the other part of this, which is kind of weird but yet interesting at the same point. So let's just do that and we'll be happy with that. So now you can see that it's been warped a little bit. Well, now I want to edit it again. I want to change something. I want to change a color. Well, remember how this works. If you double click on a smart object, this is now not a vector smart object. Remember, I converted it. I said convert to smart objects. What I have to do, believe it or not, is double click on this to open the original smart object that contains the vector smart object. Double click on this one to switch back to Illustrator. Then make whatever change I want. Save it. Switch back to Photoshop, and you'll see that the original has updated. Then I close and save that, which in turn will update the other one. So it's a little bit odd, but you have to be able to just take it a step further to say make a smart object, a Photoshop smart object, out of a vector smart object. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to talk about a similar principle to this, about how you can nest smart objects. In other words, make a smart object out of a smart object, which sounds very complicated at first, but once you start playing with it, you'll see there's some really interesting possibilities.